In the early morning hours of Sunday, September 5th, 1982, just before the sun rose over the quiet streets of West Des Moines, 12-year-old John David Ghosh stepped out of his family's front door to begin his paper route, and then, somewhere between one ordinary block and the next, Johnny Ghosh vanished. More than 40 years later, his mother would insist that her son once stood at her door again. How does a child disappear from a quiet suburban neighborhood before dawn on a Sunday morning? If this story stays with you, let us know where you're listening from as we remember Johnny Ghosh together. West Des Moines, Iowa, in the early 1980s, was the kind of place people chose because it felt steady. A growing suburb just west of the state's capital, it was made up of modest houses with neat lawns, streets that curved gently instead of cutting sharply through the land, and neighborhoods where people recognized one another's cars. It was a place where neighbors waved from driveways, where children rode their bicycles until dinner, and where Sunday mornings were quiet enough that you could hear your own footsteps on the pavement. Paper routes were a normal part of life then. Before cell phones, before home security cameras, before parents tracked their children's movements minute by minute, delivering newspapers was considered a good way for kids to learn responsibility. A child walking alone in the early hours did not feel dangerous. It felt like a rite of passage. In West Des Moines, a boy pulling a wagon down the sidewalk before sunrise blended into the background of everyday life. The Ghosh family fit easily into that picture. Noreen Ghosh was an attentive mother, deeply involved in her children's lives and quick to notice even small changes in routine. Her husband John worked full-time and often helped their son with his paper route, especially in the dark hours before dawn. Walking the route together had become part of their rhythm, a quiet shared task that belonged only to them. Johnny was 12 years old, responsible, dependable, and proud of being trusted with adult expectations. Delivering newspapers mattered to him. It was his job, his proof that he was growing up. He took it seriously, keeping his route organized and his schedule steady. When his father offered to come along, Johnny sometimes insisted he could handle it himself, eager to show that he was capable. On that Sunday morning, for reasons that seemed unimportant at the time, Johnny did not wake his father. Instead, he took the family's miniature dachshund Gretchen clipped on his route bag and stepped outside alone. It was early September. The air carried the first suggestion of fall, cool enough to raise goosebumps, but not yet cold. The streetlights were still on, casting pale yellow light onto empty sidewalks. The town was asleep as Johnny headed toward the paper drop, moving through streets he knew by heart. Inside the Ghosh home, nothing felt out of place. The morning began the way it always did. It was only later, when customers along Johnny's route began calling to ask about missing newspapers, that unease crept in. John Ghosh went out to look for his son, expecting a simple explanation, a delay, a distraction, a problem easily solved. 2 blocks from home, he found Johnny's red wagon. It was still full of newspapers. In that moment, the ordinary life the Ghosh family had known ended, and a question began that would stretch across decades unanswered. Johnny woke before most of the neighborhood, as he often did on delivery days. The house was still wrapped in that quiet that only exists before dawn. He moved carefully through the hallway so as not to wake his parents, pulling on his clothes in the low light. No one remembers exactly what he wore that morning. It wasn't the sort of detail anyone thought would matter later. What mattered was that he was dressed to work, ready to do what he always did. In the kitchen, there was no full breakfast, no long conversation. His mother was still asleep. His father lay in bed, expecting without thinking about it that he would be woken soon. Johnny clipped on his route bag and reached for the leash. Gretchen, the family's miniature dachshund, followed him, tail wagging faintly. At the door, Johnny hesitated just for a moment. It was a habit more than a decision. "I'll be back soon," he said quietly to no one in particular. Then he stepped outside. The air was cool against his skin, carrying the faint smell of grass and pavement. Early September in Iowa still held on to summer, but the edges of fall were already there. Streetlights cast soft yellow circles on empty sidewalks. Johnny pulled his red wagon down the block, the wheels rattling gently, a sound so familiar it blended into the morning. A little after 6, Johnny reached the paper drop. A few other paper boys were already there, shifting sleepily as they loaded bundles. It was ordinary in every way. Several boys would later say they remembered seeing Johnny bending to stack papers, doing exactly what he had done dozens of times before. One of them, a boy named Mike, noticed a stocky man sitting in a blue two-toned car nearby. Mike later said he saw the man talking to Johnny, It didn't look tense. It didn't look rushed. Another witness, John Rossi, also noticed the interaction. Something about it felt off to him, though he couldn't explain why. Johnny told him the man was asking for directions. "He just needs help," Johnny said. Rossi offered to assist. He glanced at the car, the license plate, telling himself to remember it. Years later, he would say, he kept hoping the numbers would come back to him in the middle of the night, clear and sharp. They never did. Johnny left the paper drop and headed north toward the start of his route. One paper boy noticed that another man seemed to follow him on foot. "Who's that?" the boy asked. Johnny didn't answer. He kept walking. A short time later, the stillness of the street was broken by a sudden sharp sound, the unmistakable slam of a car door. One of the neighbors, awake earlier than usual that morning, looked up instinctively. At the edge of her vision, she saw a silver Ford Fairmont accelerate north, its tires moving faster than felt necessary for a quiet residential street. The moment registered as odd but not yet alarming. It was the kind of detail that lodged itself in the back of the mind, waiting for context it did not yet have. Inside the Gosh home, the morning continued to unfold according to habit. The clock advanced without ceremony. Then the phone rang. It rang again, and then again. One call followed another, each from a customer along Johnny's route asking about a missing newspaper. The repetition itself became unsettling. Johnny did not miss deliveries. Dependability was part of who he was. John Gosh stepped outside, expecting to find a simple explanation waiting just beyond the front door. He moved along the familiar route at a steady pace, scanning driveways, sidewalks, and yards, his eyes searching automatically for the small signs that would tell him his son was nearby. Each step carried a growing unease, a quiet awareness that something was out of place. 2 blocks from home, he saw the red wagon. It sat near the curb, upright and untouched, positioned as if it had been set down carefully rather than abandoned. The newspapers inside were still stacked neatly, their corners sharp, the bundles undisturbed. Nothing suggested haste or struggle. The scene felt paused rather than disrupted, as though time itself had hesitated and then moved on without Johnny. John called out again, the sound of his voice carrying down the empty street. No response came back. The silence that followed felt heavier than noise would have. It filled the space where his son should have been expanding with every passing second. The realization arrived slowly, then all at once. The window of time was impossibly small. Johnny had been seen at the paper drop shortly after 6. Within minutes, he had vanished. On most mornings, his father would have been beside him, walking the route together. On this morning, Johnny had been alone. The gap between those two facts became unbearable. A routine that had always felt safe now revealed itself as a fragile line that had been crossed in moments. John turned and ran back toward the house, urgency overtaking disbelief. The call to police was made quickly, his hands unsteady as he described what he had found and what was missing. Even as the words left him, he understood how inadequate they sounded against the reality of the situation. As news spread, neighbors began stepping outside, drawn by movement and concern. Some joined the search immediately, walking the route in widening circles, scanning yards and intersections, calling into spaces that offered no answers. What had been a single family's worry began to ripple outward, transforming the quiet morning into something charged with fear and confusion. The street, so ordinary only hours earlier, now held a terrible awareness. A child had been there, and now he was not. Others stood in their yards watching, feeling the unease spread. This wasn't how mornings went in West Des Moines. By the time the first police car arrived, Johnny Gosh had been missing for less than an hour. The sun had climbed higher, revealing a neighborhood that looked exactly the same as it always had. Neat lawns, quiet streets, familiar houses. But nothing felt the same anymore. Those minutes stretched into hours. The hours pressed forward, heavy and relentless. And without anyone realizing it yet, that ordinary Sunday morning was already slipping out of reach, becoming something the Gosh family would replay again and again, searching for the moment when everything still could have been undone. By the time law enforcement arrived on the Gosh family's street that Sunday morning, the sense of unease had already spread beyond the house itself. What had begun as a father walking his son's paper route in confusion had turned into a coordinated response, unfolding minute by minute, as officers began to understand that a 12-year-old boy had vanished without explanation. West Des Moines police secured the immediate area around Johnny Gosh's route, focusing first on the 2-block radius where his red wagon had been found. Patrol officers walked slowly along sidewalks and driveways, checking behind hedges, peering into yards, and scanning every place a child might have wandered or fallen. Doors were knocked on methodically. Residents were asked whether they had been awake before dawn, whether they had heard a car, whether they had seen a boy pulling a wagon, or anyone speaking with him. As the morning progressed, the search expanded outward. Officers checked nearby parks, empty lots, drainage culverts, and construction sites, understanding that early hours offered a narrow window before any physical trace could be lost. The absence of obvious evidence quickly became alarming. There were no scuffed marks on the pavement, no torn clothing, no sign that Johnny had dropped or abandoned anything along his route. By late morning, volunteers began arriving without being asked. Neighbors, church members, and parents who had heard about the disappearance through phone calls and word of mouth came prepared to help. Search groups were formed, each assigned a specific area, each instructed to move slowly and report anything out of the ordinary. Maps were marked and remarked. Names were written down to ensure no area was missed. Tracking dogs were brought in early that afternoon. Handlers carefully introduced the dogs to Johnny's scent, using clothing from his room. The dogs moved with confidence at first, following a path that aligned with Johnny's normal route. Searchers walked behind them in silence, aware that this might be the closest they would come to understanding where he had gone. When the scent abruptly ended near the location where the wagon had been found, the meaning was immediately clear to those who understood how such dogs worked. Johnny had not simply wandered away. Something had interrupted his path. As daylight faded, additional resources were deployed. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning from above, while search teams on the ground continued moving through neighborhoods and wooded areas. Floodlights were set up as darkness fell, illuminating sections of land that had already been searched once and were now being searched again. Volunteers rotated in and out, some leaving only because their bodies could no longer keep moving. The first night passed without answers. The second day began with renewed urgency, rather than relief. A command post was established to coordinate efforts. Search grids were formalized. Officers from neighboring jurisdictions joined in, bringing more manpower and broader coverage. Roads leading out of town were checked. Vehicle descriptions were distributed to surrounding departments. Witness interviews became more focused and detailed. Investigators spoke at length with other paperboys who had been present at the newspaper drop that morning, reconstructing the scene as precisely as possible. Attention centered on reports of a stocky man in a blue two-toned car who had been seen speaking with Johnny, as well as a silver Ford Fairmont, observed speeding away from the area shortly thereafter. Every detail, no matter how uncertain, was logged and compared against the timeline investigators were building minute by minute. Despite the growing volume of information, nothing solid emerged. License plate details could not be confirmed. Vehicle descriptions were too common to narrow effectively. Physical evidence remained non-existent. There were no fingerprints, no fibers, no footprints that led anywhere meaningful. The search dog's abrupt loss of scent reinforced the belief that Johnny had been taken quickly and deliberately. By the third day, exhaustion became visible on the faces of those involved. Officers worked extended shifts, returning to the same areas again and again, driven by the fear that one overlooked detail could mean everything. Volunteers searched, despite blistered feet and little sleep. Parents kept their own children close, the disappearance altering the way the entire community viewed its sense of safety. Federal authorities were notified and soon became involved, bringing additional agents and investigative support. Their presence underscored the seriousness of the situation. This was no longer considered a likely runaway case. The circumstances pointed increasingly toward abduction, even if proof remained elusive. Inside the Gosh home, the relentless activity outside contrasted sharply with the stillness within. Johnny's room remained untouched. His belongings sat exactly where he had left them. Noreen Gosh began keeping detailed notes, documenting every call, every tip, every name, determined that nothing would be lost to time or forgetfulness. Sleep came only in fragments, interrupted by the phone and by the constant replay of that morning in her mind. Tips flooded in during the first week. Some came from nearby towns. Others came from distant states. Each was investigated with care, and each ended in disappointment. Hope rose and fell repeatedly, leaving behind a deeper weariness with every dead end. Our community understands this phase of a disappearance intimately. It is the moment when effort is at its peak, and answers are still expected when people believe that enough searching must surely lead to something. It is also the moment when fear quietly takes root, when the possibility that there may be no clear trail begins to settle in. By the end of the first week, the physical search began to scale back. Every accessible area had been searched multiple times. The helicopters were grounded. The floodlights were dismantled. Law enforcement continued investigating, following leads and reviewing evidence, but the frantic intensity of the early days could not be sustained indefinitely. The streets of West Des Moines returned to their routines. Lawns were mowed. Cars moved in and out of driveways. For most of the town, life resumed. For the Gosh family, time stopped. As the months passed with no sign of Johnny Gosh, the case did not simply cool. It fractured. What had once been a single search effort splintered into parallel paths, official investigation on one side and a mother's growing conviction on the other. By the end of the first year, law enforcement had quietly acknowledged what families in this situation come to understand long before anyone says it aloud: there were no fresh leads capable of producing answers. The case remained open, but its energy had changed. Files grew thicker without becoming clearer. Witness memories dulled. Physical landscapes shifted. Whatever had happened that morning had left almost nothing behind. Then, in the midst of that stagnation, something jolted the case back into public consciousness. Another paperboy disappeared. In August of 1984, Eugene Martin vanished while delivering newspapers in Des Moines. The similarities were impossible to ignore. A boy, a paper route, early hours. No witnesses who saw the moment it happened. No physical evidence that led anywhere. For a brief, intense period, the disappearance of Eugene Martin revived the fear that Johnny Gosh's case had planted 2 years earlier. The possibility that these were not isolated incidents forced itself into the open. For Noreen Gosh, the second disappearance felt less like coincidence and more like confirmation. She had already begun to believe that her son had been targeted deliberately. Now she was convinced that a pattern existed and that someone had failed to stop it. Her private search expanded into public action. She demanded answers not just for Johnny, but for every child who might vanish next. This was the first real emotional turning point of the case. Hope returned, but in a different form. Not hope that Johnny would be found quickly, but hope that understanding the pattern might lead somewhere at last. Public attention surged. Johnny Gosh's photograph appeared on milk cartons across the Midwest, one of the first missing children to be featured this way. His face stared out from refrigerators and breakfast tables, a quiet accusation embedded in daily life. The image carried an implicit promise someone somewhere might recognize him. It did not happen. As years passed, the image aged while Johnny did not. The boy on the carton remained frozen at 12. The world moved on without him. False breakthroughs came and went. Sightings were reported from distant cities. Some were earnest mistakes. Others were fabrications. Each one briefly reignited hope, only to extinguish it again. The emotional toll of these cycles was profound. Every possible lead demanded belief. Every collapse took something away. Our community knows this rhythm. It is the cruel pattern of unresolved loss, the way hope becomes dangerous yet impossible to abandon. Noreen Gosh refused to let the case settle into silence. She founded an organization. She spoke publicly. She challenged law enforcement practices and outdated policies that treated missing children as runaways for days before action was taken. Her advocacy helped change the law in Iowa, mandating immediate response when a child was reported missing. Similar laws would follow in other states. These victories mattered. They saved lives. But they also carried a bitter irony: the changes came too late for Johnny. As time went on, the gulf between official conclusions and Noreen's certainty widened. Investigators could not substantiate claims of organized abduction networks. Noreen became increasingly convinced that her son had been taken by something larger, more hidden, and more dangerous than a lone predator. To her, the lack of evidence did not mean absence of crime. It meant the crime had been concealed too well. The case entered a new phase, not defined by discovery but by dispute. Family dynamics strained under the weight of uncertainty. Belief itself became a dividing line, not only within the Gosh family, but among those who followed the case closely. What one person described as persistence, another quietly labeled denial. Conversations that once centered on support grew cautious, then tense. People lowered their voices when Noreen entered a room. Some avoided the subject altogether, unsure whether acknowledging doubt would feel like betrayal. Yet even those who questioned her conclusions could not deny the single immovable truth at the center of everything: Johnny Gosch was still missing. No explanation, however carefully reasoned, had brought him back. No official statement had closed the door on possibility. Absence remained the only certainty. Decades passed. Johnny would have grown into a man, then into middle age. He would have accumulated experiences, routines, disappointments, small joys, an entire life, now impossible to imagine with accuracy. Instead, his disappearance became woven into a larger national reckoning. Missing children were no longer rare anomalies. They were evidence of systemic blind spots of institutions, learning too slowly of dangers that did not fit familiar narratives. Our community understands this kind of unresolved ending. It is not neat. It does not offer the relief of finality. It leaves families suspended between grief and hope, between memory and imagination, forced to live inside a question that never stops being asked. By the time more than 15 years had passed, the case had accumulated something it never sought: mythology. Stories began to circulate with greater confidence than the facts themselves. Beliefs hardened. Doubt followed close behind. The disappearance became less about what could be proven and more about what people were willing to believe. Then, in the late 1990s, the fragile balance broke. Something occurred that would thrust the case back into public consciousness, igniting fierce emotion and renewed scrutiny. It was an event that, if true, would rewrite the entire story, and if untrue, would complicate it beyond repair, blurring the line between evidence and conviction in ways no one could easily untangle. Nearly 15 years after Johnny Gosch vanished, the case entered its most volatile phase. By then, the boy on the milk cartons had become a man, in theory only his face, forever frozen in childhood while the world aged around it. For law enforcement, the file remained open but largely dormant. For the public, the story had faded into a cautionary tale from another time. For Noreen Gosch, however, time had done the opposite of what many expected. It had not softened her belief. It had sharpened it into something unyielding. In March of 1997, long after midnight had become the hour when grief felt loudest, Noreen Gosch says she was awakened by a knock at her apartment door. It was late enough that the sound felt intrusive, early enough that sleep still clung to the edges of consciousness. She later described the moment as disorienting rather than frightening, the way unexpected events often are when they arrive without warning. When she opened the door, she claimed that her son stood there. According to Noreen, Johnny Gosch was no longer a boy. He was a grown man in his late 20s, dressed in jeans and a shirt, his hair long, straight, and dyed dark. He was not alone. Another man stood nearby, someone Noreen did not recognize. She would later say that her son appeared cautious, looking to the other man before speaking as though seeking permission. They talked, she said, for over an hour. During that time, Noreen claimed that Johnny told her he had been taken years earlier and held by a group that exploited children, that he had been discarded when he grew older and was no longer useful to them. He did not say where he lived or where he was going. He did not explain how he had come to her door. He did not stay. Before leaving, she said he opened his shirt to show her a birthmark on his chest, one she believed only her son could have. When the door closed, Noreen was left alone with an experience that defied every established fact of the case. For her, the visit was proof of life. For investigators, it was a claim they could not corroborate. There were no witnesses, no photographs, no physical evidence left behind. Johnny Gosch did not reappear. The unidentified man was never identified. Law enforcement did not confirm that the visit had occurred. The gulf between belief and verification widened dramatically. Noreen asked the authorities to create a composite sketch of what her son might look like as an adult, based on her memory of the visit. The sketch was circulated, but it did not produce results. Johnny Gosch remained missing. Public reaction was divided. Some people believed Noreen without hesitation, moved by the depth of her conviction and the specificity of her account. Others questioned whether grief and longing had reshaped memory over time. Even within the Gosch family, there was no consensus. Johnny's father expressed uncertainty about whether such a visit had truly taken place. The case, once defined by absence, was now defined by dispute. Nearly a decade later, in 2006, another event reignited controversy. Noreen reported that photographs had been left at her doorstep. Some depicted boys bound and gagged. One image she believed showed Johnny Gosch as a child restrained and marked. Another image showed an adult man possibly deceased. To Noreen, the photographs were not only confirmation of her long-held beliefs, but evidence that her son had been targeted deliberately and systematically. Authorities investigated the images and traced at least some of them to a separate incident in Florida from years earlier, involving boys who had staged an escape contest. Law enforcement officials stated that there was no evidence the photographs depicted Johnny Gosch, and that the images predated his disappearance. An anonymous letter sent to police supported that conclusion. The original investigator from the Florida case corroborated parts of the explanation, though not all details could be independently verified decades later. Once again, certainty fractured. Noreen rejected the official explanation, maintaining that one of the boys in the photographs had never been identified and insisting that the image was of her son. To her, the fact that authorities could not conclusively disprove the connection mattered as much as their inability to prove it. Our community understands why moments like these become emotional fault lines. When answers have been withheld for years, any new information, no matter how uncertain, carries enormous weight. Evidence does not arrive in a vacuum. It lands on years of unanswered questions, sleepless nights, and unresolved grief. Around the same time, older claims resurfaced. In the late 1980s, a man named Paul Bonacci had alleged that he was part of a group that abducted children and that Johnny Gosch had been among them. He claimed personal involvement in the abduction and described details about Johnny's body that were not widely publicized. His statements were taken seriously by some private investigators and dismissed by law enforcement, who cited alibis and inconsistencies. Decades later, Bonacci reiterated his claims, including assertions that Johnny had visited his mother in 1997. Investigators did not find his testimony credible. The official position remained unchanged. What emerged from this period was not resolution but polarization. The case now existed in two parallel realities. In one, there was no verifiable evidence that Johnny Gosch had survived past the morning of his disappearance. In the other, a mother held on to lived experiences she believed were undeniable. The story took on a life of its own. Conspiracy theories flourished. Allegations expanded. The absence of definitive answers allowed speculation to fill the space where facts had failed to accumulate. For many observers, the case became less about Johnny Gosch and more about what people believed the world was capable of hiding. Yet beneath the noise, one truth remained unchanged. No arrest had been made. No body had been found. No conclusive proof had emerged to explain what happened on that Sunday morning in West Des Moines. Our community knows how dangerous this stage can be. It is the point at which unanswered questions begin to attract certainty of the wrong kind, when belief hardens into identity and disagreement becomes personal. It is also the stage at which families risk being judged, not by their loss, but by how they cope with it. For Noreen Gosch, the claims that surfaced over the years, the testimony, the photographs, the accounts that others dismissed as unreliable or inconclusive, were never experienced as distractions or detours. In her mind, they formed a single, continuous narrative, one that had been fragmented and obscured, not by chance, but by institutional failure and a reluctance to confront possibilities that did not fit established frameworks. Each claim, each image, each story reinforced her belief that what happened to her son could not be understood through conventional explanations alone. Whether the world accepted that narrative was ultimately beside the point. Her commitment did not depend on consensus. It depended on fidelity to her memory of Johnny, to what she believed she had seen and heard, and to the conviction that abandoning that belief would mean abandoning her son a second time. So she continued. She spoke publicly, she wrote. She repeated her account even as skepticism hardened around it, even as the years stretched on and the distance between belief and proof grew wider. For law enforcement, the case occupied a very different and increasingly uncomfortable position. It remained unresolved, but also unproven in every direction. Investigators could neither confirm nor fully dismiss the claims without evidence that met the standards required to act. Each assertion demanded consideration, yet none could be substantiated in a way that allowed the case to move forward. The file stayed open, but it grew heavier, with time burdened not only by unanswered questions but by the weight of competing narratives. What had once been a straightforward missing person investigation now sat at the intersection of fact, belief, and public controversy, a place where certainty was impossible and neutrality was often mistaken for indifference. By the end of this period, the disappearance of Johnny Gosch had become something far larger than a single boy who vanished on a quiet morning. It had become a mirror reflecting how society responds when certainty fails, how institutions prioritize evidence over experience, how grief reshapes memory, and how the human need for answers can collide with the limits of proof. The moment many hoped would bring clarity instead brought conflict, drawing sharp lines between belief and skepticism, empathy and doubt. And with that conflict came a final sobering realization, one that settled heavily over the case and everyone connected to it. The truth, whatever form it ultimately took, might never arrive in a way that satisfied everyone, might never resolve. The tension between what could be proven and what was profoundly, painfully believed. As the years went on and Johnny Gosch did not come home, the search did not end so much as it changed shape. What had once been a frantic physical effort, boots on sidewalks, hands parting bushes, voices calling into the dark, became something quieter and more exhausting. It became a series of possibilities, each one opening a door that people stepped through with hope, only to find themselves standing in another empty room. The first possibility was the one no parent ever wants to consider, but almost everyone around them eventually does. There were those who believed Johnny had been taken by a lone predator, someone passing through, someone who saw an opportunity and acted quickly. It fit the narrow window of time. It explained the absence of a struggle and the sudden end of the scent trail. Investigators explored this path repeatedly. They reviewed known offenders. They followed tips about suspicious men and unfamiliar cars. They checked records, interviewed individuals, and compared timelines. Every time the trail dissolved, no name stayed attached, no evidence held. Then there was the theory that Johnny had wandered away and met with an accident. That possibility drove some of the most grueling searches. Crews returned again and again to drainage ditches, wooded areas, and abandoned structures. They searched places that had already been searched, driven by the fear that one missed corner could hide the truth. Nothing was ever found. No clothing, no trace. The land gave nothing back. As months stretched into years, another idea took hold, one that was both terrifying and strangely hopeful. The belief that Johnny had been taken deliberately, not at random, and that he might still be alive somewhere. This theory gained strength when another paperboy, Eugene Martin, disappeared under eerily similar circumstances. 2 boys, 2 routes, 2 quiet mornings. To many it felt impossible that this was coincidence. Parents whispered about patterns. Investigators compared notes. For a time, hope flared that understanding one case might unlock the other. But again, there was no physical thread connecting them, no proof that could survive scrutiny. Still, the idea refused to die. Sightings began to be reported. A boy who looked like Johnny in a grocery store. A teenager in another state who bore a resemblance. Each report sent ripples through the family. Each one was investigated. Each one ended with the same hollow phone call explaining that it was not him. Years later, when Johnny's photograph appeared on milk cartons across the country, another door opened. People studied faces more closely. Clerks looked twice at unfamiliar boys. Strangers called in tips convinced they had seen Johnny grown a little older. The image traveled farther than the search ever had. And yet it still did not bring him home. As time passed, the search for Johnny became inseparable from the search for meaning. Why had he vanished so completely? Why had no one seen the moment it happened? Why had no evidence surfaced even accidentally? Some began to believe the explanation must be larger than a single crime, that Johnny had been taken as part of something organized, hidden, and protected. This belief did not arise out of fantasy but out of frustration. When small explanations failed repeatedly, people reached for bigger ones. Noreen Gosch, more than anyone, walked this path. She spoke to private investigators. She listened to stories others dismissed. She connected dots that official reports could not confirm. For her, the persistence of unanswered questions meant the truth had been concealed, not absent. When she claimed that Johnny came to her door years later, it was not experienced as a revelation but as confirmation. To her, it fit what she had already come to believe, that her son had survived, that he was alive but unable to return, that the danger had not passed. That belief reshaped every subsequent effort. The search was no longer just about finding him. It was about protecting him. Others struggled with this version of events. They wanted to believe it, but they could not reconcile it with the absence of proof. Even so, the claim changed the emotional landscape of the case. Hope, which had once been tentative and fragile, became fierce and immovable. Then came the photographs. When images appeared that Noreen believed showed her son in captivity, another surge of energy ran through the story. People leaned in. Authorities investigated. Explanations were offered. Counter-explanations followed. Once again, the case stood at the edge of revelation, only to retreat into uncertainty. Each hypothesis carried its own emotional cost. To believe Johnny had died meant accepting a finality that felt unbearable. To believe he lived meant accepting that he was suffering somewhere out of reach. To believe the truth would never be known meant living permanently suspended between those two extremes. Our community understands this torment. It understands how the mind circles the same questions year after year because letting go of them feels like letting go of the person themselves. It understands how hope can become both sustenance and punishment. The search for Johnny Gosch never produced a single, undeniable answer. Instead, it produced layers of effort, searches, conducted theories, tested beliefs, formed and challenged. Each layer represented people trying in the only ways available to them to bring a boy back into focus. And so the story did not resolve through discovery but through endurance, through a family's refusal to stop asking, through a community forever changed by the realization that a child could vanish without warning, through a nation forced to reconsider how it responded when that happened. Johnny Gosch remained missing, but the effort to find him, to understand what happened, to prevent it from happening again, never truly disappeared. As the years accumulated and Johnny Gosch did not return, life did not so much heal as it rearranged itself around a permanent absence. For the Gosch family, there was no moment when grief ended and something else began. There was only adaptation, learning how to breathe around a space that could never be filled. Inside the family, time moved unevenly. Some days passed quietly, marked by routine and distraction. Other days carried a sudden weight triggered by nothing more than a date on a calendar or a boy's face seen in passing. Birthdays became reminders instead of celebrations. Holidays were endured rather than anticipated. Every milestone Johnny should have reached existed only as a question. Noreen Gosch did not withdraw from the world. She moved toward it. In the years following her son's disappearance, she transformed her private grief into public action. What began as a mother's determination to keep her child visible became a broader mission to change how missing children were treated. She spoke at schools, at community gatherings, and before lawmakers. She described what it felt like to be told to wait, to be advised that her son might simply come home on his own, to feel time slipping away while policy remained unchanged. Her advocacy contributed to the passage of legislation in Iowa requiring immediate response when a child was reported missing. Similar laws would later appear in other states. These changes altered the landscape for families who came after the Gosches, ensuring faster action, broader coordination, and greater urgency in the critical early hours of a disappearance. The creation of national organizations focused on missing and exploited children was part of this same wave of change. Johnny Gosch's name became intertwined with those efforts, his disappearance cited as an example of what could happen when systems moved too slowly. In this way, his absence saved others even as it remained unresolved itself. Our community understands the complexity of this legacy. It recognizes the painful irony that meaningful change often arrives only after irreparable loss. It knows the strange mixture of pride and sorrow that accompanies progress born of tragedy. Within the Gosch family, however, the public impact did not erase private strain. The years of uncertainty took a toll on relationships. Belief and doubt coexisted uneasily. Coping mechanisms differed. What sustained one person felt unbearable to another. Over time, these differences created distance. Johnny's parents eventually separated their grief, traveling in different directions. This, too, is something our community recognizes. Loss does not always draw families closer. Sometimes it exposes fractures that had always existed, widening them under pressure. There is no right way to survive a disappearance. There is only the way each person manages to keep going. Public attention ebbed and flowed. Periodically, Johnny Gosch's case resurfaced through documentaries, articles, or renewed discussions about missing children. Each resurgence brought fresh scrutiny and often fresh judgment. Some people admired Noreen's refusal to abandon hope. Others criticized what they saw as an unwillingness to accept uncertainty. The debate itself became part of the story. Yet beneath the arguments, the essential truth remained unchanged. A child had vanished. A family had been left behind. No explanation had arrived that could settle the matter. For West Des Moines, the disappearance marked a quiet turning point. The town that once trusted its routines became more cautious. Children were watched more closely. Early morning paper routes faded away. Parents reconsidered what independence looked like. The sense of safety that had once gone unquestioned was replaced by vigilance. These changes were not dramatic. They did not arrive all at once. They settled in, slowly shaping behavior over years rather than days. In that sense, Johnny Ghosh's absence became woven into the fabric of the community, not always spoken about but never entirely forgotten. On a national level, his case joined a growing awareness that missing children were not rare anomalies but part of a larger problem that required coordinated response. Faces on milk cartons, once a novel idea, became symbols of a country grappling with its vulnerabilities. Johnny's image, frozen in childhood, stared back from kitchen tables, reminding families that danger did not always announce itself. Our community understands how these images worked. They were not just pleas for information. They were daily confrontations with the possibility of loss woven into ordinary life. For Noreen Ghosh, the work never truly ended. She continued to assert that her son was alive, living under an assumed identity, unable to return safely. Whether others accepted that belief mattered less to her than remaining faithful to it. To stop believing in her view would be to let Johnny disappear a second time. Years became decades. Johnny would have grown into middle age. He would have built a life that no one could now reconstruct. That imagined life existed alongside the frozen image of a 12-year-old boy, creating a dissonance that never resolved. The case did not conclude. It settled. It settled into law books cited as justification for reform. It settled into advocacy organizations referenced as a catalyst for action. It settled into the consciousness of parents who heard the story and tightened their grip on their children's hands. And it settled into the Ghosh family, who learned to carry uncertainty as a permanent companion. Our community knows that not all stories end with answers. Some remain open not because effort was lacking but because truth did not leave a trail that could be followed. These stories demand a different kind of courage, the courage to live without resolution, to remember without certainty, and to act with compassion, even when clarity never arrives. Johnny Ghosh's disappearance did not produce the ending anyone wanted, but it did leave behind a legacy measured not in closure but in consequence, in laws changed, in lives protected, in a collective understanding that attention matters, that early action matters, and that forgetting is the one outcome that cannot be allowed. And so, even as the years continued to pass, the story remained, not finished, not solved, but still being carried. Johnny Ghosh does not exist in the present tense the way other missing children sometimes do. There is no confirmed photograph of him as an adult, no verified location, no final answer that allows the story to close. And yet he has not disappeared from the world. He exists in the way missing children are treated now, in the laws that require police to act immediately instead of waiting, in the national systems built to share information quickly, in the training materials that remind officers what early hours mean, in the quiet urgency that follows a report of a missing child today, an urgency that did not exist when Johnny walked out into the dark that Sunday morning. He exists, too, in the instincts of women who listen to stories like this and recognize something familiar, the tightening in the chest when a detail feels wrong, the memory of a time when the world felt safer than it was, the knowledge that danger does not always announce itself loudly. Our community understands that not all stories offer closure. Some leave us with responsibility instead. Responsibility to pay attention, to trust what we sense even when we cannot yet explain it, to ask one more question, to make one more call, to refuse the comfort of silence when something feels off. For women who have lived long enough to see how systems fail and improve, this story carries a quiet instruction. You do not need proof to act on concern. You do not need certainty to speak up. Calling for help is not being dramatic. It is being careful. It is being present. It is being the adult someone needed when no one else was watching. The disappearance of Johnny Ghosh reminds us that vigilance is not fear. It is care. It is the recognition that small moments matter, that ordinary routines can hide extraordinary risk, and that attention, real attention, can change outcomes. This story does not end with an answer. It ends with a truth that is harder to hold, but more useful, that remembering is an act of protection, and that the voices willing to stay with uncertainty are often the ones that prevent it from happening again. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause or look twice at something you might otherwise ignore, then Johnny Gosch has not been forgotten, and neither has the lesson his absence continues to teach.